Welcome to the Sacred Child Summit. I'm Kathleen Sherrick, your host, and I'm pleased to welcome today Deirdre Fay. Deirdre is an MSW, Master's of Social Work, is a thought leader with 35 years of experience exploring the intersection of trauma, attachment, yoga, and meditation, which she calls modern-day Bodhisattva training. A bodhisattva is someone who chooses to discover practices that turn suffering into compassion. Healing then is not an accident, but it is the result of persistent and consistent practice that develops a secure and stable self. Meditating since the 70s, then living in a yoga ashram for 6 years, Deirdre brings a unique perspective to being in the body. In the 90s, she was asked to teach yoga and meditation to those on the dissociative unit of a major teaching hospital. With skill sets in trauma treatment, attachment theory, and body therapy, Deirdre sees an integrative approach that she uses, which has been called a radically positive approach to healing trauma. Her best-selling third book, Becoming Safely Embodied, is based on the life-changing skills that she teaches groups of clinicians and clients. She's also the author of Attachment-Based Yoga and Meditation for Trauma Recovery, Becoming Safely Embodied Skills Manual, and co-author of Attachment Disturbances for Adults. She also has contributed to neurobiological treatments of traumatic disassociation. There's a lot of words there and they're really important, Deirdre. Welcome to the conversation today.
Always thrilled to be with you. And I love, love, love the topic. And I know this has been something dear to your heart, this idea of a sacred child. And it's so important because we need to cherish these beings that are coming into our world and give them the environment in which they can flourish and develop and really stay connected to themselves through the process.
Well, you have done such beautiful work with adults who may have had experiences in childhood that were not all positive and uplifting and all. And so your work really does inform what we would like to share with parents, grandparents, educators, and child professionals. And so I'm just grateful for your insights today and sharing what your work has been about. Thank you for being with us. You talk about repair is more important than doing it right, and that we put so much effort on kind of being perfect that we can lose how important it is to actually model making mistakes and things like this. And so how important is it to make mistakes in life?
Well, if I think about it with kids, certainly, I mean, with adults, it's absolutely true too, but with kids, the developmental process is to make mistakes. That's, we fall down, we get up. Maybe falling down is considered a mistake. You should be walking all the time. No, you fall down so you learn how to stand back up. You learn how to do it wrong so that you learn more. What's a different way? What's a better way? What way serves you better? And we've gotten into this awful place of making people wrong for making mistakes. And yet we need that. Now, some of the research that I have found absolutely interesting around this has been with developmental psychologists who work with parents and observing with kids. And they take projects like a jigsaw puzzle or throwing a ball. And what's it like to have a parent doing this with a kid? And what they see is the parents who take over the task, instead of breaking the task down into smaller and smaller bits, the kids actually end up with more complicated results, whereas the parent says, okay, let's figure out how to do this. And what would you do now? And how might you do this? And I don't know, let's try. Let's make it smaller so that you can take that next step. Those are the kids that learn and grow up with a growth mindset, a willingness to see challenges as an opportunity to explore and get better rather than it's an opportunity for failure.
And so instead of having our adult mind that might say there's one way to do this, and so I'm going to show my child the one right way,
right,
to instead engage cooperatively with them and really honor what they bring to the table in that particular task or problem solving situation.
So
Is that
true. I think one of the dilemmas is that many parents haven't learned, many adults haven't learned or haven't had that themselves. So when faced with a task, they feel, and this has happened to me many times, I feel like I should know how to do it. And so I bumble my way through rather than asking for help because I just don't know how to ask for help. Or asking for help so it creates so much vulnerability. And so when we learn how to take things into smaller and smaller bits, the threat level goes down. And we, instead of activating our fears, our blocks and our resistance, we actually start thinking, oh, well, what might the answer be here? And how could I do this? And we begin to flow a little bit more easily with it rather than there being a right answer. And I guess I really believe and have seen that when we train ourselves as adults and certainly help kids access their own inner wisdom, they know there's something that they know and that they can then learn to follow that. And that's such a missing piece in today's world.
You know, there are some approaches to education, Waldorf, Montessori, Reggio Emilio, and others, and they recognize that the child, or each of us, has an inner teacher. And it sounds like that's in some of your training as well, that we have this inner voice of wisdom, and that as adults, that we might want to be mindful of what touchstones can bring us back to that if we forget.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I mean, certainly in the spiritual tradition, so much is about training ourselves to access what I call the vertical access, that the access, the greater good, the spirit above, and also the great mother below. How do we line up inside where the meeting place is our heart and listen and begin to listen to our heart so that our heart guides the way, not our head, not our understanding or our thinking about what we should be. And really life begins to change when that happens.
And in that alignment, Deirdre, what you're talking about then really is that the body becomes the connector. Yes. And so much of your work has been about becoming safely embodied. So why is it important to be in our bodies?
Well, when I think back into my own life, like I didn't realize I had a trauma history until I was in my 20s. And it was while I was living at the yoga ashram in that safe world, my own history came up and I was like, I just had no idea. And I remember working out in the gym there and looking into a mirror and for the first time saying, oh, that's who I am. That's me. Like I was somewhere in my consciousness, I don't know where I was, but when I started linking up that, oh, I have a physical body, then it was like, okay, what happens in here? And I can remember going on dates and somebody saying to me, well, what do you want for dinner? And I'd be like, I didn't know. I didn't know if I wanted pea soup or a salad. I had nothing inside that was telling me. I was so used to being numb to my own experience. So I couldn't navigate from inside. I was always pretending to be somebody. And so that's what we see with a lot of trauma and a lot of what we call neglect is that people shut themselves off. They learn that their needs aren't important, what they think is important, big boy shouldn't cry, you shouldn't X, you shouldn't Y, and we take that on. And so we shut down our own native intuition and understanding. And then we have to relearn it later on. And one of the beautiful things that you've always talked about is that children have that. The sacred child has that. Now we may become separated from our sacred child, but how do we return there? And how do we gift that to people and children in our lives?
And so by doing body work, it helps us be more fully present or available, or for those who may not understand what it, we just kind of take for granted. We have a body. I have a body, of course I'm in it. And yet, if we encounter situations in life, and especially if we are parenting or grandparenting or caring for children, and we're not fully inhabiting our bodies, how might that affect how we relate to children as well as the children in our care?
Well, let's take the example of being triggered or reactive around. So somebody says something hurtful or mean to you, and we start reacting and we're angry and we express it. Well, that doesn't always do any good. So what would it be like to take a moment to pause and say, wow, I'm really reactive. My body's really like thumping away inside here. I have an impulse. I want to yell or say something disparaging. Let me just pause and take a moment and let that, what I call rise, crest, and fall, let it move through so that my body can not let go of its charge enough that I can say, who do I want to be in this moment? Do I want to be a tyrant, or do I want to just like, land back in love? But if I'm not connected to my body, I'm going to be acting out of my reactions all the time. I'm going to be triggered and let the trigger run the show instead of my own sacred connection to myself. And I'm going to lose the love and the connective love tissue between whoever I'm with.
And the honoring of the rise, crest, and fall. So you're almost stepping aside and being an observer of your own emotion, of your own trigger. Is that what you're saying?
Right. This was probably 20, 25 years now. I was driving somewhere and I stopped at one of those roadside restaurants, and I was sitting there, and a man and his kid had just landed at a table nearby, and the kid was totally upset and yelling and wanting his dessert, whatever it was, I don't even remember. And the dad was saying, no, you have to have your meal first. And the kid was so furious about that, wanted his way. And the dad turned to him and said, yeah, you're really angry, aren't you? And the kid, yeah, I'm just, Dad said, yeah, I can see that you're really, really angry at me. You really want to have your dessert first. And the kid said, yeah. The dad kept just mirroring that back. And at one point, the kid just like let it go. It was like he was met with his anger. Nobody was making him wrong or shaming him. And so his little body could have that full expression and then be done with it. And I think how rare that is. If somebody gets mad, do we get mad back? Do we start escalating? And then the other person has to escalate. And then it's like we're butting heads the whole time. But instead, and we can do this inside our own skin, let alone with somebody else, just let it come up. My husband and I had an interaction last night where I felt a little bit made wrong. And he's a master at this. He just didn't get angry. He just listened, didn't get defensive. And my whole thing came up, and then it was done. I still felt the little ping inside, but that's my ping. That had nothing to do with what went on. That's like old stuff that I can clean out. And that's the benefit of having a body, being in a body, being conscious of my own experience, so that I can choose my experience rather than letting experience hijack me.
And so when you talk about being in the body, it's kind of beyond body. It's emotions. It's whatever you allow the body to feel is what it sounds like. Is that right?
I'm so glad you asked that, Kelly, because we're not mechanical beings. We can't just take apart and say, well, I have a body, I have a mind, I have a heart. It's like we're a whole being. And so it is an integrated whole. It's maybe it's more, how do I live from the inside of my life out versus, from certain levels. If I just talk to you from my thoughts, if I just have my feelings and I'm overwhelmed by my feelings, or And some people who are in body therapies will just break it down to their sensations all the time. And no, we're whole beings. We're consciousness. We're a consciousness. We're an awareness through which love and light and sacred experience is flowing. So once we choose to be integrated, then we open up the channels for the greater love to come through, how love is expressing uniquely through me, through you, and all of us.
That's a beautiful way to explain it, because sometimes there aren't words to explain what we might be sensing or feeling, and when there's a separateness to emotion, mental, physical, then what you're saying is that's when we can get in a little bit of trouble, because we're all together, we're all one.
Yes.
And the
Yes.
body holds it.
The body is our concrete expression. And yet, I remember when my own trauma history came up, I was thinking, the ancient wisdom traditions say the body is the temple for the soul. But at that point, with trauma exploding inside me, I didn't feel like I was living in a temple. I felt like I was a mess. And so it's reclaiming that and learning how to, it's like gardening. We're cleaning out the garden of our heart so that we can choose the experience we want to have instead of being overwrought by something.
So as adults that are caring for children, having this awareness of ourselves sounds really important in order to be able to be conscious in how we show up around children.
It's essential. Because for one thing, especially younger kids, they are attuning to us energetically. So we might be here in our heads talking to them, and they're in their hearts and their bodies are connecting. And if we're not aware of the signaling we're putting out into the world, and if there's a mismatch, it's going to be so confusing. And this is one of the key things that people later on in life come into therapy for. They say they're confused because somebody is saying this, but wait, that doesn't feel right. Right? There's a dissonance between the two. And it's learning how to pay attention. This is what I know. This is what I'm picking up. That's part of how people land in the body. And if we're dissociated from ourselves, then we don't know how to listen to our own inner signals, or we don't know how to trust you. If you're a bad person and you're smiling and you're happy and everyone around is saying you should, oh, look at that person, is so nice and they're so good, then you're going to discount what you're knowing, which is that's a creep over there. And you're not going to pay attention to this. And that's where we end up getting in trouble or getting hurt.
And so that inner voice, that inner knowing is something that we can cultivate from the beginning, perhaps in children, so that they can stay strong and centered in that. Is that one thing you're suggesting?
Absolutely.
How can we do that? How can we do that?
Well, one of the key things I'm thinking that you're pointing to, Kathleen, is how do I honor and respect this being that's different from me, that has needs and wants separate from me. This being is becoming its own unique and special expression in the world. How do I honor that? How do I just marvel at that amazing human being and how weird and goofy and unusual and dynamic and fabulous they are? But what we do out of our own stuff is we want you to be, good and quiet and whatever it is, so that I feel better. And yet, once I start co-opting the kid or the other person, that's the grounds for disruption. And so we need to just keep practicing how to delight in other people, while delighting in ourselves and recognizing that space and that separation from each other.
I love this phrase, delighting in other people. How do we do that?
Well, it can be really scary for people if you hadn't been delighted in, then to have somebody love you up and be warm and see the best in you can be scary as anything. I remember I used to have a little Maltese puppy that was my therapy dog and came to work with me. And when we would go and greet the people in the waiting room, when we were in a practice with a lot of people, this little white bundle of love and fluff and would go running and just vibrating with joy. And people either melted or they were freaked out. And I think that's true. Think of it with a kid. A kid comes to you, they find you're walking down the street and they pick up a stone or a stick and they show you and they're like, look, oh my gosh. And you're like, oh, that's just a stone. That's going to squash them. But if you meet them there and be, oh my God, you found it? That's amazing. That kid is going to be able to fill up and swell with who they are. And what we're looking for is having people be full of themselves in the very best way so that they can then let it go. Now we know that grandiosity and narcissism happens when there hasn't been that kind of delight in the other. And instead, because it's a normal, native, natural need to be delighted in, then we have to puff ourselves up. And we have to, pretend that we're fabulous. And we might be fabulous, but there's a push to it rather than a full expression. If you think of it energetically, people, when they're full of themselves in the very best way, which is something I think is very true about you, you can be in the room full of yourself and there's room for other people too. It's not like it's all about me. And we all know what it's like to be with people when they, suck all the oxygen out of the room. And it's deflating. But when we can be with people like that, there's a fullness and a generosity of spirit that's there. I went on a long tangent there, Kathleen, but that's about delight.
I don't think that's a tangent. I think spurring delight and being in a state of delight with children and with our own inner children, our own inner child, our own inner teacher, inner wisdom. I think this is a beautiful concept that if we could embrace and crystallize within our own everyday life, it can really change a lot of things. That the whole notion of delight, because delight like lifts us, it kind of snaps us out of something else.
Right. And it's one of the fundamental attachment needs we all have. And if we don't have the kind of needs of reassurance and warmth, comfort, soothing, sense of belongingness, if we don't have guidance and mentoring, if somebody doesn't help us navigate conflict so that we can repair it and get stronger, if we don't learn these basic things, how not to take life personally, we grow up with if it happens chronically, it's actually where shame comes from, the sense of that there's a shock to our system. We're reaching for delight or we're expecting connection and it's not there. Or on a physiological level, below the cortical level, there's a shock to our system. And
wow.
When that happens over and over, that is really where shame comes from, that there's something fundamentally wrong with me, that I needed love and I didn't get it, that I needed warmth and reassurance and I didn't get it.
You just went right through, I think, there are some attachment needs that we have, right? Could you explain some of those? You said delight is one. What were some of the others that you mentioned?
Well, most fundamentally, it would be the need for physical safety, emotional and psychological safety, and belongingness. That when we have that as a very basic level, a sense of I feel safe in my own skin, I feel safe psychologically, and I feel like I belong to a tribe of people. Then John Bowlby, who's a grandfather of attachment theory, said, anytime we step outside of our comfort zone, we're going to have some kind of anxiety or fear or trepidation. But if we know that there's warmth and safety, a safe haven to return to, it mitigates some of that. So having that basic sense of belongingness to others is so, so, so important. So then knowing how to have reassurance and comfort, being able to calm the body, be calmed by another. Attunement, which is where somebody senses who you are and is interested in you, and it knows that you're separate from me, and just, who is over there? Interesting that that's how you are. And we all have that need of being known before we even say or ask for it. And that's a fundamental need that most people don't have, is that sense of, oh, somebody's so attuned to us that they'll provide for us and give to us these very basic things. When we have that, our system just relaxes so deeply. We feel seen and known. You were going to say something there, Kathleen?
Well, are these things that we can train ourselves to do? If we did if we did not experience this ourselves somewhere along the way, in some educational approaches, there's certain windows of time where children are sensitive for learning, like it's a beautiful window for reading, and this is when certain things may be presented to them. In this realm, are there sensitive times for learning these things, and can we teach them to ourselves?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Absolutely. That's what all my work is about, is retraining our body, mind, and heart to have these new experiences. But just because, that's why I call it a modern day Bodhisattva training. We are training ourselves to be who we want to be in this lifetime, not live out that reactivity and those imprints from our past. So you didn't get it. Most of us didn't get it. The research is 3 out of 4 of us don't have a secure attachment, that we may have earned it, but we didn't have it. So, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to crumple and die and feel like poop? No. It's like, okay, this is, I also call it an Olympian endeavor. It takes time and effort and consistency and practice, and absolutely you get there. I see that in my community all the time. People are growing and developing and flourishing, becoming who they want to be, becoming solid and steady inside, because they're training themselves.
And with children, I'm going to say something that might sound a little crazy. Is it possible to prevent trauma in our children?
Well, it's a funny thing. I'm not so sure, but what we do know is that if we have an environment where children feel safe to come and say something bad happened, that the repair is there. The research is undeniable about that. The reason why trauma doesn't resolve is because of the underlying attachment issues. So if a kid doesn't feel safe within the belongingness structure, then that rupture that trauma is going to make it more complicated. We saw this, a lot of the research was done around Vietnam vets. And why did some vets have more PTSD than others? What creates that sense of resilience? And fundamentally it comes down to, at some level, knowing that you were cared about and wanted, and that you were special to somebody, that you belonged to somebody.
So it's not as important so what's more important is the repair, is right, how you treat what has happened, not so much trying to prevent and trying to have a perfect childhood for your child. Yeah. And by perfect, it's kind of in quotes, but because I believe that perfect, as there's a certain definition, that means you live life, you let your child live, which means they're making mistakes, which for some people might mean it's not perfect, but for that child, it might be perfect.
Right. And the developmental psychologist, Ed Tronick, who's really has done some amazing work. What he says is stress creates character. You need a certain amount of optimal stress in order to develop yourself as a character. You need to be able to be in the world, getting bruised at times, and then coming back to your safe haven and having people sort it out with you and figure out, well, okay, that didn't work. So you didn't get an A, or you didn't get invited to the drama club, or that birthday party you weren't invited to. Okay, let's see, what is that about? How can we do something different? How can we let you know that you're loved and special, and that there are other people who value you?
That sounds very important. And you have created this modern day Bodhisattva training, which I love everything about that. Why don't you share with our audience just a little bit about what a Bodhisattva is, so that we understand what you've created?
Well, in the ancient wisdom traditions, it was somebody who had reached a certain level of spiritual, psychological development and chooses to stay on the human plane to help others. And I think of it as somebody who is deliberately choosing to take their suffering and transform it into compassion, not just for themselves, but a gift for all humanity. How do we collectively move ourselves forward?
It's a beautiful way of putting it. Bodhisattvas, to my knowledge, are about service.
Exactly.
And this is about opening the heart and serving instead of moving to another level, staying put and serving. And now, how can we, through our own filters as adults and the children that we're caring for, how can we help children develop in ways that are this resilience? You've mentioned the attachment needs that they have. Are there some simple things we could do on an everyday basis that we might not be thinking of? If the morning is really rushed and we've got several children and they've got to eat and get dressed, and these are young children, maybe they're going to be with their extended family, or maybe they're going to a daycare. Are there things that parents can be mindful of in that process that addresses the attachment needs without kind of calling full attention to them?
Well, one of the things that haven't talked about, which I think is so important, is certain boundary settings. Like it's not about having kids run roughshod over us. It's ability to be able to say, no, that isn't right, or you can't, but to do it without the reactivity that we bring to it. Like, how do we stay connected inside ourselves to our own vertical axis so that we can be connected up there, and maybe corral that incredible energy that a kid has. And if you have more than one kid, you're dealing with a lot of energy. And how do you help them corral that, harness it, so that they begin to learn how to stay with themselves and move forward?
What if we were able to see the best in children no matter what they do?
Exactly.
So whether they're having some kind of a fit, which everyone has, whether they're having some kind of their own personal trauma with a T, like there's a little caterpillar they can't catch, or whatever that might be. How can we as adults kind of step out of the false self of us, step into our real self? What suggestions do you have for us to help them be seen for who they are?
That's such a great question, and I think it's probably moment to moment. But I think kids, adults are all going to be saying at some point, they're going to be letting us know. And what I am probably more interested is not, if we can meet them in that place, great. But what if we miss that? What if we miss that connection? What if later on at night we're laying in bed, we're like, oh gosh, how do I then go back and repair it and clean it up? How do I say to the kid, gosh, I really miss that chance to see the best in you, or to thrill at who you are. And I'm sorry about that. I was organized in my own stuff and got lost. And so we're training them. There's this whole idea in attachment here about mentalization, that we're different, that you have a mind of your own and I'm over here with my own stuff going on, but I can still bridge that gap. I can still find you. Maybe not perfectly all the time, but I can circle back. And that seems to make the greater difference than doing it perfectly the first time around.
That is a message for parents everywhere, because anyone who has raised children or been in a classroom with children, been grandparents, aunts, uncles, been an extended family, to be aligned in the moment takes a certain level of mastery. And sometimes we can be there, and oftentimes we can't be there because of other things that are influencing us. So if we know that being thoughtful or mindful about this, even after the fact, even can have a stronger effect, that's amazing. That's mind-blowing.
And the impact on the other person is huge, whatever age it is.
That is,
for kids, then they feel valuable. They feel remembered in the mind and heart of the person that matters the most to them.
are there situations, Deirdre, in which children need to kind of play out their own life story, whether it's their own karmic situations, their own dharma, dharma being, their purpose in life?
Yes, for sure. And isn't that the exact challenging opportunity to see the person as their own unique person? How do we step back and say, wow, this is what's happening to you. Wow. Oh, you just used my car and you hit somebody. Oh my God, what are we going to do with this now? This is shaping, this experience is not shaping me, yes, but it's shaping you. Who are you? How can we use this experience for you to be shaped into who you want to be? How do you want to be expressed through it? Sure, you're angry at me, you're going to blame other people, somebody else is wrong, all that, but is that who you want to be? And if there's been the training and the consistent training along the way, somebody will be able to shed more easily some of those defensive responses and allow that consciousness, that wisdom, that inner teacher, that guide to come through. They can learn to depend on their own sense of love.
Their own sense of love. That's a big, beautiful concept. And you explained Bodhisattva so beautifully. Excuse me. How would you explain karma for those that may not be familiar with the term and what it signifies?
It's such a big topic, and it doesn't, I don't know, it's really what we do, the thoughts, the feelings, the body sensations that are happening in this lifetime. And that, am I going to perpetuate them? Am I going to continue to live them out? We talk about the imprinting of that. So if my karma is my biological, physiological experience of who I am in this lifetime. This is the mental capacity, the heart capacity, and so this is who I am. And I can choose to enhance that, or I can choose to live in a contract around it. Am I going to choose to keep putting more negativity into what we call the mind stream, or am I going to practice deliberately shifting it and adding more positivity to that? Am I going to train myself to move toward a more nourishing experience of life than the negative imprints of not just this lifetime, but any previous lifetime, if we believe in that?
Sometimes with young children, when they're in a situation with other children, especially, there can be, because there's new social interactions and all, there can be dynamics that occur. And parents may not be as familiar with, that for example, might feel my child needs to be right in this scenario. And yet what you're mentioning here is that I think what you're saying is if we step back and say, my child has their own journey here. So those social interactions with that child who I may think my child is right here, they may have to work something out here.
Exactly right. And if we've done enough along the way, then we can say that, well, what do you want to have happen here? And we can do that at every level of development, because we're training them to explore like who they want to be. Now, if we haven't done a lot of the base work, then we can't at 7 ask them to do that, because they're going to be numb to themselves. They're going to be not have language. And so then we have to do a lot of other building up work to be able to, for them to trust that they can trust themselves and they don't have to say what I think they should say or be who I think they should be.
Every 2-year-old, every 3-year-old comes right out of their mouth, right where they stand, right what's going on, if you are able to allow it in the environment. And so there's a blessing in that. And then there's also, as you're mentioning, kind of a centering of ourselves so that we're not triggered or moved in a different direction if something comes out of their mouth that we don't agree with, or we may hear differently than what they're saying, and those kinds of things. But those 2 and 3-year-olds, they are blunt. That comes right out. Whatever they're thinking comes right out.
So true.
You talked about your safely embodied transformational model. It highlights using our protest to point us in a new direction. Can we use this with children? And what does this mean, using our protests?
So we all have that experience of something happening and be like, oh, I don't like that. It shouldn't be like this. When I started taking the attachment theory and mapping it onto life, it was like, that's what protest is. We're like, I don't like this. I don't like this is happening. In the attachment world, it was based on watching kids separated from their parents and what happens over time. But if we basically call everything that we don't like protest, we're pushing against it. We're like, no, it shouldn't be like this. What inside of us, this is what I was so fascinated with, what inside of us knows it shouldn't be like that? If it was supposed to be like that, that's how it would be. But something inside of us says it should be different. What is that? And how do we begin to orient to that and unplug from the protest so we can move in a different direction? And that's when I started working with the attachment needs. Because that's the key. If you're protesting against something inside you knows it should be different, that some need is unmet. So let's look, what's the need? And then once you have that need, can you fill up with a longing for that, which is so hard for most of us because we're like, that's too much, or we scare ourselves or we overwhelm ourselves. But really it's about opening ourselves for everything that we want. Because that's the rocket fuel that's going to actually move us in the direction of where we want to go and help us navigate and surf the turbulence of life that comes up. Because I'm going to start reaching for something new and it's going to be, no, you shouldn't do that. Really? What are you doing? I'll get anxious. I'll get depressed. I'll have lots of thoughts that go on. I'm going to go back to safety, go back to it. And many of us do, right? We go back to where we are more comfortable. And yet then we lose the opportunity of expanding. And the whole purpose of life and what the ancient wisdom traditions say is we are meant to grow and develop and become. That's the whole point. That's why we're here on the planet, is to become fully ourselves, to return home to ourselves. So that's what I'm most interested in, is how do we do that? How do we navigate that as gracefully as we can? And so that as a collective whole, we're all contributing our best into the world and having the experiences we want to have.
And so these protest points, sounds like it would be helpful to children if we notice if they're having some protest points.
Oh, for sure.
And to help to give them language around that, or what would you suggest? How can we help kind of enable or ennoble them to recognize those protest points so they can realign?
I just watched on the street the other day a kid in what do we call them? Not a perambulator. What do we call them? Anyway, those little
stroller.
Stroller, thank you. And the kid was reaching for the parent and crying, and the parent ignored, and the hand just went like, fell. The cry was for something. The fall and the collapse of the hand is for something. If we turn to the kid and say, what do you need, honey? What's going on? You're reaching for something. There's some need that you have. That's where a kid needs attunement, because a kid might not know what's going on. So we go through a whole list of what possible things are there. And somehow just having that attention and that somebody being curious and interested and wanting to help, that allows the kid to begin to understand their own, what we say, their own mind, heart development, whoever is in there, so they can begin to put some of the pieces together. So when a kid is we're protesting 20,000 times a day of something's not right. So how do we begin to look and say, oh, right, okay, what would be better? It's a really simple thing. In yoga, there's the idea of always there's an opposite. This happens, that happens. We do a forward bend, our body stretches up and we want to wiggle around and stretch. It's just that opposite. So we know that natively. Just how do we begin to develop that psychologically and emotionally?
And with young children, pre-verbal, there are other, it's almost an energetic really exchange of
Right.
information if you can be open to it with them, because they do, as in utero, as infants, before they're walking and talking, they are communicating. And the whole notion that they have protests, and if we are aware enough to notice their signs of protest. I know if a baby is nursing and they're not comfortable, they will have a protest. Their body moves in a certain way. So mama moves her body to adjust to that
Accommodate,
protest.
right.
Yes. So that kind of notion of being aware of protests in an infant, in a toddler, is really important to aligning
There's
with who
another
they
piece
are.
that you're bringing up, which is, I think, also important, is that because, especially at that early age, they're so attuned to us energetically, and they're still in the fused state, that it's less around, I'm here as an infant and you're there as a parent. They're one with us. So if we're having a crummy day, they're going to have a crummy day. So part of it is looking to see, how is they're picking up my crummy day. How can I use that as a way to, let me get a grip here. Let me help pull this energy off this kid so they don't have to carry my stuff for me.
So in other words, if a child is protesting, in a sense, it's another layer of discernment on our part to understand, are they reflecting me? Are they reflecting how I am right now? Because we are so entwined at the moment.
Right.
That is really a good point of self-reflection that's needed.
And that's the sacred adult relationship, right?
Yes.
So that we're not loading up the kid with all our stuff.
Yes, it is. Deirdre, are there any other words of wisdom or insights from your decades of experience?
Oh my gosh.
Now, I have one question for you, and then you just share whatever's on your heart here. But it sounds like what you're saying is, no matter what happens in childhood, or it's never too late to be a whole person.
Never, absolutely. That's the gift. That's the gift, is that we always can become who we want. Learning, life is trying to say, keep turning toward what nourishes you. Let your light shine. We just have to learn the simple skills of how to do that and practice it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again.
Practice, practice, practice. The modern day Bodhisattva training.
You got it, girl.
Thank you, Deirdre. And I understand that you have a free gift that you'd like to offer to our audience.
Oh, sure. There's two things. One, if you're interested more in trauma, we have I think it's a 43-page PDF on the Safe Guide to Healing Trauma. And that's dfay.com/safe guide. And if you're interested in your attachment profile, we call it the relationship profile. We have a quiz you can go through, and that's dfay.com/profile.
And we will have we have links to all of those, and how you can reach Deirdre and her beautiful work. All those links are accompanying this video. So Deirdre, a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for the work that you do.
I love what you're doing. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity just to be with you, Kathleen.
I enjoy it as well.